even honest construction contractors are sometimes forced into a position where they have to misuse a project owner's money for reasons that are beyond their control. Robbing Peter to pay Paul, essentially using the money that you, as a project owner, give them, not on your project, but to complete the work, on someone else's project. And there's, shades of gray here, a sliding scale here of different kinds of contractors. Some are entirely honest, and it would never be their intention to do this. But because of the pressures that contractors face, even the honest ones can sometimes find themselves in a position where they're having to do, this robbing Peter to pay Paul just to stay afloat financially so that they can, complete one project, move on to the next, and get money from some other project owners so that they can complete your project, even if it was never their plan to do so. And it's important for project owners to understand that whenever you have somebody that does work first, right, like contractors, and then get paid second by owners, there is the very difficult spot that the contractor is put in, because it's not always the case that a project owner is going to pay the general contractor. It might be the end of the project, and they might say, I feel like you overcharged me. I'm not going to pay you that last $100,000, and even honest contractors, that have done good work and, are only asking to be paid a fair price in accordance with the contract, will encounter an owner for one reason or another that's got their nose out of joint that's going to short pay them. And in the event that that happens, that can create a real financial ripple effect, for the general contractor. Most general contractors, in particular those that work on residential projects, aren't sitting on a couple $1,000,000 in cash. And if the owner of one project is going to stop paying them or is going to short pay them, at the end of a project, that can have a real, gut punch effect on them financially. And you're scrambling as a contractor to keep yourself afloat, particularly when, if you're not doing work, the owners won't pay you, but you can't do the work unless you're able to pay your subs. And so you can get in this vicious cycle where, you're not getting the payments that you're expecting as a contractor, and you can't pay your subs, and the subs won't work. And because the subs aren't working, the owners don't want to pay. And so, there are certainly, all kinds of contractors. There's some that are very honest, and there are some that are less so, and those that are not entirely honest, sometimes it's, close to a Ponzi scheme, where it's the business model is to rob Peter to pay Paul, and when you have a homeowner that gets pulled in on a sales job from a contractor and they write, an initial deposit check of $100,000, it immediately gets put in a concrete and steel that's going to go into somebody else's project, and the homeowners almost have to just pray that the contractor doesn't hit the skids in some way, that they're unable to move off that project and move on to their project, and that the contractor is going to find the money somewhere to kind of get the work moving. And so if you are a homeowner or really any project owner and you don't want to put money into someone else's project, if you realize that even honest contractors who are well-intended, are sometimes forced to misuse the money that an owner will give them to stay afloat. If you want to avoid that peril, there's only one way to do it, and that is to have a good construction contract, a contract that is going to tend to hedge against the risk that the contractor is going to be able to get away with using their money on another project. There's no such thing as a piece of paper that a homeowner can sign that would absolutely guarantee that this, hazard isn't gonna, smack them in the face on their project. But, if you sign whatever piece of paper the contractor's going to give you, whatever proposal they're going to give you, and you don't have a thoughtful construction contract, a real construction contract that's going to provide, certain assurances for you where money's going to be escrowed, and, you're going to sort of see the money being used for your project in real time based upon the kinds of paperwork that you're going to collect from the contractor, all of which is spelled out in the contract. If you don't have the foresight to protect yourself against this risk. You're really just, off on a hope and a prayer that, that initial down payment that you're going to give them, or even the payment that you're making them in the middle of the project, that money is going to be used for the reasons that you intend. So, if you're a project owner and you want to avoid the risk of losing your money, you have to recognize the realities of construction. You have to realize the difficulties that contractors face, and you have to make a decision to protect yourself in advance of giving the contractor money by having a good construction contract.